The room went quiet the moment the sentence landed. Ms. Reynolds, you'll no longer be wearing a flight suit in this facility. For half a second, nobody breathed. The hangar at the Joint Training Center outside Tonopah, Nevada, was a cathedral of steel and shadow. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A line of instructors stood near the briefing screens. Rows of trainees sat stiff-backed flight boots, planted hands folded, waiting for whatever came next. The smell of jet fuel clung to the air, sharp and metallic. Margaret Reynolds stood alone near the center aisle, 61 years old, short gray hair pulled back tight. No rank on her shoulders, no unit patch. Just a plain olive flight suit worn thin at the elbows, zipped all the way up like armor. Colonel Thomas Vaughn didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority lived in the pause, in the way everyone else instinctively straightened when he spoke. Late 50s, square jaw. Hair clipped short, the kind of man who still filled out his uniform like it mattered. This is not personal. Vaughn continued, hands clasped behind his back, as he paced, once slow measured. It's about optics, standards, clarity of roles. Maggie didn't move. From the second row, Captain Eric Lawson shifted in his seat. Early 40s, former Navy. He'd flown combat sorties over the Middle East before half the room had graduated high school. His eyes flicked from Vaughn to Maggie, then back again. He frowned just slightly. Colonel Lawson said carefully, Ms. Reynolds is contracted as a senior technical advisor. She's cleared for... Vaughn stopped walking. He turned his head just enough to acknowledge Lawson without fully facing him. A subtle correction. A warning. She's a civilian observer, Vaughn said. Nothing more. Observers don't need flight suits. They sit. They watch. They take notes. A few trainees exchanged glances. Nobody spoke. Maggie felt the heat rise in her chest, slow and steady. Not anger, something older, heavier. She'd felt it before, in rooms like this, with men like him. She looked at Vaughn, really looked. He avoided her eyes. Is there a safety issue? Maggie asked. Her voice was calm, even. The kind of voice that didn't ask, unless it already knew the answer. Vaughn met her gaze now. His eyes were pale, unreadable. There's a cohesion issue, he said. This program trains future leaders. Uniformity matters. When someone stands out, it disrupts the chain. Chain of what Maggie wondered. Command, silence. She glanced around the room. At the trainees, most of them young. Early 20s, clean faces, eager, nervous. They'd been watching her since day one, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. The old woman, the math lady, the consultant who still walked like she belonged on the flight line. One of them, a kid with a buzz cut and restless hands, swallowed hard when her eyes passed over him. He looked away. Understood, Maggie said. The word landed softer than expected. A few shoulders eased, relieved the tension hadn't exploded. Vaughn nodded once, satisfied. Thank you for your cooperation, he said. You may continue your duties in appropriate attire. He turned back toward the podium, already moving on, already done with her. The briefing resumed. Slides changed. A voice droned on about safety protocols and evaluation metrics. Nobody looked at Maggie anymore. She stood there for another beat, then reached up and slowly unzipped her flight suit. The sound was quiet, cloth sliding over metal teeth. But it carried. Lawson's head snapped up. Maggie shrugged out of the suit with deliberate care, folded it once, then again, each movement precise, controlled, like a ritual. Underneath, she wore plain slacks and a white button-down shirt, civilian, unremarkable. She held the folded suit for a moment, then placed it on the empty chair beside the aisle. No speech, no protest. She walked toward the exit. As the hangar doors slid shut behind her, the noise rushed back in. Engines whining in the distance. A jet taxiing somewhere beyond the concrete walls. Life continuing indifferent. Outside, the desert stretched flat, an endless heat shimmering off the tarmac. Maggie stopped, closed her eyes, and breathed. Behind her, Captain Lawson pushed through the door. Maggie? He said. She turned. Lawson hesitated, hands on his hips. He looked uncomfortable, angry, unsure which he was allowed to be. That was unnecessary, he said finally. She gave a small smile, not kind, not bitter, just tired. It was inevitable, she said. They respect your work, Lawson insisted. They do. Even Vaughn. He just doesn't like variables he can't categorize. Maggie studied him. The creases at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he said Vaughn's name. You think this was about a uniform, she said. Lawson didn't answer. A pair of younger instructors walked past them, voices low. One glanced at Maggie, then quickly looked away, guilt flashing across his face like a fault light. Lawson followed her gaze. This place runs on appearances, he said quietly. Sometimes the image matters more than the truth. Maggie nodded. That's exactly the problem. She picked up her folded flight suit and tucked it under her arm. I'll submit my report by end of day, she said. Same as always. Lawson watched her walk toward the parking lot. The desert wind tugged at her shirt. She moved with the steady confidence of someone who had long ago stopped trying to prove she belonged. Inside the hangar, Vaughn finished his briefing. Applause followed thin but obedient. He straightened his notes, satisfied. From the observation deck above, a contractor named Paul Hensley leaned on the railing watching Maggie's car disappear in the distance. Mid-60s, former Air Force safety analyst. He'd recognized the way she folded that suit. He exhaled slowly. That's a mistake, he murmured to no one. Below, Vaughn gathered his papers. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Order restored, disruption removed. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. Because Margaret Reynolds didn't stop flying when she took off that suit. She just stopped doing it where permission was required. The house was quiet in the way only desert mornings could be quiet. Margaret Reynolds woke before the sun, as she always did. 5:45 in the morning. Her body no longer needed an alarm. It remembered routines the way scars remembered pain. She lay still for a moment, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling above her bed. The house in Prescott was small. One story built sometime in the 70s. Nothing fancy. Paid off years ago. She liked that. No debt. No leverage. No one calling to remind her of obligations. She sat up, feet touching the cold tile, and listened. Wind brushing against the mesquite outside. A distant truck on the highway. The hum of the refrigerator kicking on and off. Ordinary sounds. Grounding sounds. In the bathroom mirror, she studied her reflection. 61 looked different on different people. On her, it showed in the lines around her eyes, the stiffness in her shoulders, when she turned too fast, the faint tremor in her left hand that only appeared when she was tired. But her gaze was steady, still sharp. She dressed simply. Running shoes, gray sweatshirt, baseball cap pulled low. The flight suit hung folded on a chair in the corner of the bedroom exactly where she had placed it the night before. She hadn't moved it, hadn't needed to. Outside, the air was cool, the sky just beginning to pale. Maggie started her run, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. She ran the same route every morning, a loop through the neighborhood and out toward the scrubland beyond the last row of houses. The rhythm settled her breathing. One foot, then the other. Steady. As she ran, her mind replayed the hangar. Vaughn's voice, Lawson's hesitation, the way the trainees had looked at her as if she were both invisible and dangerous. She didn't hate Vaughn. That surprised people when she admitted it. Hatred required energy she'd learned to conserve. What she felt was something colder. A precise awareness of patterns. By the time she returned home, sweat dampening her collar, the sun was fully up. She stretched on the back porch muscles, protesting mildly, then went inside to shower. At 8:15, her phone rang. She didn't answer right away. She finished drying her hair, wrapped a towel around her shoulders, then picked up the phone and glanced at the screen. Paul Hensley. She answered. "You awake?" Paul asked. "I've been awake for hours," Maggie said. Paul chuckled softly. He always did that, as if trying to lighten a weight he never quite named. "You make the rest of us look bad." She could picture him, leaning back in his chair, glasses sliding down his nose, coffee growing cold beside a stack of reports. They'd known each other too long to waste time on pleasantries. "You left an impression yesterday," Paul said. "Did I?" Maggie replied. "You didn't argue," he said. That scared them. Good. There was a pause. She could hear papers rustling on his end. "Words already moving," Paul said. "Unofficial channels, retired pilots, safety boards, people who remember names others try to forget." Maggie closed her eyes briefly. "I didn't call you." "I know," Paul said. "You never do." "Then why are you calling me?" Paul exhaled. "Because Vaughn filed a preliminary report this morning." Her jaw tightened. Just slightly. "What kind of report?" "Concern about program cohesion," Paul said. "Recommendations to limit civilian advisor access, particularly yours." Maggie leaned against the kitchen counter. "He's building a paper trail." "Yes. And you're warning me." "I'm asking you," Paul corrected gently. "Are you done? Or are you about to make this bigger?" She didn't answer right away. Paul filled the silence. "Because if you are Maggie, I need to know. Once certain doors open, they don't close quietly." She looked toward the chair in the bedroom where the flight suit still rested. "I didn't plan to do anything." "That's not an answer," Paul said. "No," she agreed. "It's the truth." Paul sighed. "I saw the flight schedule for next week." Her attention sharpened. "What about it?" "Joint evaluation exercise," he said. "French contingent. Rafale unit. You know the one." She did. Everyone in her line of work did. "They requested an independent safety and tactics observer," Paul continued. "Someone with prior NATO interoperability clearance." Maggie's pulse slowed. And your name came up," Paul said. "Not from Vaughn, from the French." She almost smiled. "Almost. I haven't been cleared to be on base," she said. Paul hesitated. "That's the thing." "You are. Just not in the way Vaughn thinks." She straightened. "Explain." "Different authority," Paul said. "Different chain. Evaluation exercise falls under joint oversight. Vaughn doesn't control that airspace, or that briefing." Maggie closed her eyes again. The shape of the board was becoming clearer. Pieces aligning, not because she forced them, but because they had always been there. "I'm not flying," she said. "I know," Paul replied. "You wouldn't. That's not who you are." Silence settled between them. "Maggie," Paul said quietly, "if you step back onto that base under a different mandate, it will provoke him." "He provoked himself," she said. Still, Paul pressed. "You won't control what comes next." She looked out the window at the empty street, the desert stretching beyond. "I never have." Paul let out a slow breath. "If you do this, you're done consulting here. You know that." "Yes." "And the press will circle," he added. "They always do, when foreign aircraft fly low over American concrete. Yes." "And Vaughn won't go quietly," Paul said. Maggie opened her eyes. "Neither did my brother." Paul went silent. "I'm not asking you to protect me," she said. "I'm asking you not to stop what's already in motion." He swallowed audibly. "You're certain?" "I've been certain for a long time," she said. Paul nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Then I'll make sure the paperwork doesn't get lost. Thank you," Maggie said. After the call ended, she stood there for a long moment, phone still in her hand. The house felt smaller now, charged, as if it sensed the shift. Later that afternoon, she drove to the community college, where she taught twice a week. The classroom smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old books. A dozen students sat scattered across the room, most of them older themselves. Veterans, retirees, people who'd come back to education after life had taken its turns. She taught them about systems, feedback loops, small errors compounding over time, how ignoring early warning signs didn't make them disappear. It just made the consequences louder. A man in the front row raised his hand. Late 60s. Former machinist. "So what do you do when the system's broken from the top?" he asked. Maggie considered him. "You document," she said. "You prepare. And when the moment comes, you make the failure visible." After class, as she packed up her bag, a younger instructor lingered by the door. He hesitated, then spoke. "I heard what happened at the base," he said. She met his eyes. "Did you?" "I just wanted to say," he continued, "my father flew with people like you. He said the best ones were always the quietest." Maggie nodded once. Your father was observant. That evening, as the sun dropped low and the desert cooled, Maggie returned home. She poured herself a glass of water, then went into the bedroom. She picked up the flight suit, ran her fingers along the seams, the worn fabric, the familiar weight. She folded it again, placed it back on the chair. Then she opened her laptop and began reviewing airspace maps she hadn't needed in years. Outside, somewhere far beyond Prescott, preparations were already underway. A French fighter squadron adjusting routes. A base commander signing off on schedules he barely glanced at. A man named Vaughn drafting memos he believed would keep the world neatly arranged. None of them knew yet, but they would. Soon. The email arrived at 6:12 in the evening, buried between a utility notice and a reminder from the community college about next semester's enrollment numbers. Subject line, Joint Evaluation Exercise Briefing Confirmation. Margaret Reynolds read it once, then again. No flourish, no explanation. Just coordinates a time window and a list of names copied in quiet confidence. French Air Force Liaison, Joint Safety Board, Restricted Distribution. She closed the laptop without replying. Dinner was simple, soup warmed on the stove, bread torn by hand not cut. She ate standing at the counter, listening to the local news murmuring from the radio. Politics, heat advisories, a story about funding cuts at a nearby veterans clinic. Familiar disappointments delivered in the flat cadence of routine. Afterward, she washed the bowl, dried it carefully, and placed it upside down on the rack. She wiped the counter twice. Order mattered when the rest of the world felt like it was shifting under your feet. She stepped outside just as the sun dipped behind the hills. The sky burned orange, then red, then softened into purple. Somewhere high above a small aircraft crossed the horizon, its engine a distant whine. Maggie tracked it without thinking, calculating altitude speed vector. Old habits never disappeared. They just went quiet until needed. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. Unknown number. You were right to keep your credentials current. Captain Laurent Duval. We remember Spectre. Maggie stared at the screen. A corner of her mouth twitched, something close to amusement. She typed back slowly. I'm not flying. The reply came almost immediately. Neither am I asking you to. We need eyes. Judgment. Someone who understands when the numbers don't match the story. She slipped the phone into her pocket and looked back at the darkening sky. Inside, she pulled an old binder from the bottom drawer of her desk. No labels, just a strip of faded tape on the spine. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside were printed diagrams, handwritten notes, incident summaries. Not classified, not secret, just inconvenient. She flipped to a page marked with a crease. A diagram of a training route. Annotations in her own handwriting, wind conditions, fuel margins. A red circle around a waypoint that never should have been cleared. Daniel had trusted that clearance. Her fingers tightened on the paper. She closed the binder. Across the state, Colonel Thomas Vaughn sat in his office under harsh fluorescent lights. His jacket hung neatly on the back of his chair. He loosened his tie and stared at the preliminary report on his screen. Language mattered. He chose words carefully: concern, alignment, risk mitigation. He'd learned long ago that you didn't need to accuse someone outright. You just had to suggest doubt and let the system do the rest. A knock sounded at his door. "Come in." Major Elaine Porter stepped inside. Early 50s, impeccable posture. She'd built her career in compliance and logistics, not flight. She carried a tablet close to her chest. "Colonel," she said, "there's a scheduling anomaly for next week." Vaughn didn't look up. There always is. "This one's different," Porter said. "Joint exercise, foreign aircraft." He glanced at her now. "I'm aware. They've added an independent safety observer," she continued. "Civilian. Contracted through a different authority." Vaughn's eyes narrowed. "Name?" Porter hesitated just a fraction. "Margaret Reynolds." The silence stretched. "That's not possible," Vaughn said flatly. "She's cleared," Porter replied. "Not under our program. Under joint oversight." Vaughn leaned back in his chair. The corners of his mouth hardened. "She's no longer part of this facility." "With respect," Sir Porter said carefully, "that's not your call in this case." He stood abruptly. "I want eyes on every movement," he snapped. "Briefings, access points. I don't want surprises." Porter nodded, though unease flickered across her face. "Understood." When she left, Vaughn paced the length of his office. Reynolds. Always Reynolds. Even after years, she had a way of appearing at the wrong moment, like a flaw in a system he thought he'd sealed. He stopped by the window, looking out over the runway. Aircraft sat motionless in the fading light, sleek shapes, waiting for purpose. Control depended on predictability, on eliminating variables. Margaret Reynolds was a variable. Back in Prescott, Maggie slept poorly. Dreams came in fragments, a rotor chopping the air. A voice over the radio, strained, then gone. She woke before dawn, heart pounding the room dark and still. She sat on the edge of the bed until her breathing steadied. By mid-morning the next day, she was back at her desk reviewing the joint exercise packet that had been uploaded overnight. French terminology interwoven with American standards. Clean. Precise. A different philosophy of flight, but one she respected. She made notes in the margins, not about maneuvers, but about assumptions. Her phone rang just before noon. "Ms. Reynolds," a voice said, accented but clear. "This is Captain Duval. I trust you received the materials." "I did," Maggie said. "We are honored by your participation," he continued. "Your previous evaluations are still discussed in our squadrons." She let that pass. "What exactly do you want from me?" "Truth," Duval said, simply. "Not flattery, not politics." A pause, and he added perhaps restraint. "There are sensitivities." Maggie almost laughed. "I'm very good at restraint." "I believe you," Duval replied. "Which is why we asked." After the call, Maggie drove into town for groceries. She moved through the store unnoticed, choosing apples, bread, coffee. An older man near the checkout stared at her for a moment, then smiled politely. She smiled back. To him, she was just another woman buying groceries in a desert town. That anonymity felt fragile now, like glass under pressure. At the base, word continued to spread. Quietly. Instructors whispered. A few pilots searched old forums late at night, finding half-remembered references to a consultant who'd once grounded an entire program with a single report. Some dismissed it as legend. Others felt something like anticipation. Captain Lawson sat alone in the briefing room, after hours replaying footage from a past exercise Maggie had reviewed. He'd dismissed her comments then as overly cautious. Watching now, he saw what she'd seen: the near miss, the delayed correction, the moment where instinct had saved what procedure had nearly lost. He leaned back and exhaled slowly. In her kitchen that evening, Maggie poured herself a small glass of whiskey. She rarely drank, but tonight felt earned. She stood by the window glass in hand, watching the stars emerge one by one. She thought of the trainees, of the way they'd watched her fold that flight suit, of what they'd been taught about authority, about obedience, about when to speak and when to stay quiet. She finished the whiskey and set the glass down. Her phone buzzed once more. Paul Hensley again. "It's moving faster than I expected," the message read. "Media accreditation requests are already in. Someone leaked the exercise window." Maggie typed back, "Let it move." A moment later, his reply came, "You're sure?" She looked up at the night sky, vast and indifferent. Yes. She went to the bedroom and placed the flight suit into a garment bag, not because she planned to wear it, but because it belonged with her when this chapter closed. She set the bag by the door. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows softly. In a few days, engines would scream overhead. Lines would be crossed. Stories would be told that could not be untold. Margaret Reynolds lay down and closed her eyes. This time, when sleep came, it did not run from her. The base woke before dawn, but the tension had been awake all night. Floodlights cut across the tarmac, bleaching the concrete into pale gray. Support vehicles rolled past in steady lines. Radios crackled. Checklists were read aloud, then read again. Everything moved with purpose. But beneath the precision ran a current of unease, the kind that came when people sensed history nudging closer. Margaret Reynolds arrived through the south gate at 0600 hours. No escort, no ceremony. Her name was already on the access list, filed under Joint Evaluation Authority. The guard checked her identification, glanced at the screen, then back at her face. His eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, handing it back. She nodded and walked on. She wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a plain jacket, comfortable shoes. The garment bag rested against her hip, light but familiar. She moved through the base like someone who remembered every turn, every distance, every blind corner. Muscle memory guided her feet where maps never could. From the control building, Colonel Vaughn watched her cross the apron. His jaw tightened. "She's early," he said. Major Porter stood beside him, tablet in hand. Joint observers often are. Vaughn didn't reply. His gaze tracked Maggie until she disappeared into the briefing annex near the foreign delegation quarters. The sun had just begun to rise, throwing long shadows that stretched like fingers across the runway. "She shouldn't even be here," he muttered. Porter shifted her weight. "Sir, the authorization came from higher than us." Vaughn turned sharply. "Everything comes from somewhere," he said, "and everything can be managed." Inside the annex, the air smelled different. Less fuel, more coffee. Voices carried accents that softened the hard edges of the place. Maggie stepped inside and was greeted by Captain Laurent Duval, tall, lean hair already graying at the temples. "Madame Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. "You are punctual. So are you," Maggie replied, shaking it. Duval gestured toward the briefing table. Maps were spread out. Tablets flickered with live data. A small French flag sat beside an American one, both understated. "We will begin shortly," Duval said. "I wanted to thank you personally." There was resistance. "There always is," Maggie said. Duval smiled thinly. "Yes, that is why independent eyes matter." As the briefing started, Maggie listened more than she spoke. She watched how the pilots leaned forward when discussing risk, how the American instructors folded their arms, how Vaughn stood at the back, silent, observing his presence, a pressure in the room. When the discussion turned to flight corridors and safety margins, Maggie spoke. "This assumption here," she said, tapping the map lightly. "It relies on predictable wind shear. This area has produced anomalies before." One of the American instructors frowned. "We've flown this route dozens of times." "And nothing went wrong," Maggie said. "Until it did." The room stilled. Duval nodded. "We will adjust." Vaughn stepped forward. With respect, he said, voice controlled, "This is an evaluation exercise, not a dissertation. The margins are acceptable." Maggie met his eyes. "Acceptable to whom?" "To Operational Command," Vaughn replied. "Operational Command has buried pilots for less," Maggie said quietly. A few heads turned. Someone cleared their throat. Duval raised a hand. "We will proceed with revised parameters," he said smoothly. "Safety first." Vaughn's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Outside, the Rafale sat on the apron, like a coiled animal, its delta wings catching the early light. Technicians moved around it with practiced efficiency. The French pilot, Lieutenant Marc Lefebvre, climbed the ladder with a calm confidence that came from long familiarity. Maggie watched from the observation deck as the engines came alive. The sound rolled across the base, deep and resonant, vibrating in the chest. Conversation stopped. People turned. This wasn't scheduled for public viewing, but word had spread. In Hangar 7, trainees gathered near the open doors, pretending to be busy, while their eyes stayed fixed on the runway. Captain Lawson stood among them, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "What's going on?" a young pilot whispered. Lawson didn't answer. In the control tower, Vaughn barked orders into a headset. "Confirm authorization. Confirm airspace." "Airspace is clear," the controller replied. All flights coordinated. The Rafale taxied forward. Maggie slipped on a headset as Duval offered it. She didn't sit in the cockpit. She stood behind the glass, one hand resting on the rail eyes, tracking every movement. Spectre Duval said softly over the channel, using the old name without irony. "We are rolling," Copy, Maggie replied. Her voice was steady. "Maintain discipline." The jet surged down the runway and lifted cleanly into the sky. A few seconds later, it climbed steeply, banking hard, the roar fading into a distant thunder. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Vaughn stared upward, fists clenched. The Rafale returned on a low pass, precise and controlled, then climbed again, executing a maneuver that tightened Maggie's chest despite herself. The aircraft moved like an extension of thought, every adjustment deliberate. Over the open channel, Maggie spoke. "Notice the correction at the apex," she said. "That's what happens when you respect the envelope." The words carried through speakers in the hangars, into offices, into spaces not meant for instruction. Heads turned. Phones came out. "Who's that?" Someone whispered. Lawson felt a chill. He knew that voice. The jet rolled, climbed, then leveled out. Not a show. An explanation written in motion. "Airframe stress within limits," Duval reported. "As expected," Maggie said. In the tower, Vaughn slammed his hand against the console. "Shut that feed off," he snapped. The controller hesitated. "Sir, it's a joint channel." "Do it." Negative, came the reply. Authorization does not allow interruption. Vaughn stared at the controller, disbelief flickering across his face. Below, the Rafale executed a final pass, slower this time, deliberate. As it crossed the base, Maggie leaned toward the microphone. "This is not about spectacle," she said. "It's about accountability. When data is ignored, people pay the price." The words settled heavy in the air. The jet climbed away, engines fading into the distance. Silence followed. Not applause, not cheers, just a stunned quiet as people absorbed what they'd witnessed. Vaughn turned from the window, his face pale. Porter stood rigid beside him. "Sir," she said carefully, "we have multiple calls coming in." Vaughn didn't answer. He was staring at the screen, where Maggie's name glowed quietly among the authorized personnel. On the apron, Maggie removed the headset and handed it back to Duval. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "You flew clean." Duval hesitated. "This will have consequences." "It already has," Maggie replied. As she walked away, Lawson stepped into her path. "Maggie," he said, voice low, "what did you just do?" She met his eyes. "I showed them the margin they were pretending didn't exist." He swallowed. "Vaughn won't let this go." She adjusted the strap of her bag. "Neither will I." Behind them, somewhere in the base phones, continued to ring. Messages were sent. Screens lit up. The desert sun climbed higher, indifferent to the reckoning it had just illuminated. By midday, the phones would not stop ringing. Margaret Reynolds learned this not from the noise, but from the silence. The kind that crept in when systems froze, when people waited for instructions they were afraid to ask for. She felt it as she walked back through the administrative corridor, the echo of her footsteps, too clean, too loud. Doors were closed that were usually open. Conversations dropped the moment she passed. She had not embarrassed anyone. She had not accused. She had simply spoken into a channel that had never expected to hear her voice again. That was worse. In Colonel Vaughn's office, the blinds were drawn. He stood with his back to the room, phone pressed hard to his ear knuckles white. His voice was low-controlled, but it carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "I don't care who authorized it," he said. "That feed never should have been public. That was not the scope." He listened, jaw working. When he spoke again, it was slower, more deliberate. "Yes, I understand. Of course. We'll conduct an internal review." He ended the call and remained still for a long moment, staring out at nothing. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and toner, orderly, predictable, everything he believed in. Until now. Major Porter hovered near the doorway, tablet clutched to her chest. She had been receiving updates in real time. Congressional staffers requesting briefings, safety boards flagging anomalies. A regional reporter asking why a foreign aircraft had performed a low-altitude evaluation over a domestic training base with live channels open. "Sir," she said carefully, "Joint Oversight has requested documentation from the past 5 years. Incident reviews, training deviations, any safety waivers." Vaughn turned slowly. His expression was composed, but something behind his eyes had hardened. "This is a fishing expedition," he said. "Yes, sir." "And she started it." Porter hesitated. "With respect, sir, she didn't violate protocol." "That's not the point," Vaughn snapped. "She violated hierarchy." Porter didn't respond. She simply nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. Across the base, Captain Lawson sat alone in the ready room. Hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. The television mounted in the corner played silently a news chyron crawling beneath footage of the Rafale captured from someone's phone. Blurred, distant, enough to spark speculation. Lawson watched Maggie's words replayed as text on the screen. Accountability, ignored data, consequences. He thought of the last near miss he'd written off as bad luck. The way the debrief had glossed over it. The relief he'd felt when no one was hurt. He felt less relieved now. Maggie returned to Prescott that evening, driving the long way home. The desert stretched wide and empty, the road humming beneath her tires. She rolled the window down, letting the wind rush in, carrying dust and sage and heat. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Paul Hensley. She didn't answer immediately. She pulled over at a turnout engine, ticking, as it cooled and then picked up. "They're circling," Paul said, without preamble. "I expected that," Maggie replied. You forced their hand, he said. The safety board has opened a preliminary inquiry. Not public yet, but it will be. Maggie leaned back against the seat, staring at the darkening sky. That's what they're supposed to do. Paul hesitated. Vaughn is furious. She almost smiled. That's also expected. Maggie Paul said quietly. This won't stay technical. He'll make it personal. She closed her eyes. He always does. There was a pause. Are you prepared for that? I've been prepared for years, she said. I just didn't know when. When she got home, her answering machine blinked with 3 messages. One from the community college, about a schedule change. One from a former colleague who didn't leave a message. And one from a local news station asking for comment. She deleted the last one without listening. That night, sleep came fitfully. Dreams layered over each other, the hum of engines. A radio call cut short. A voice asking for confirmation that never came. She woke before dawn, heart-racing sheets tangled around her legs. She sat at the edge of the bed until the shaking passed. The next morning, the first email arrived at 8:30. Subject line notice of administrative review. It was polite, impersonal. Informed her that her access credentials were temporarily suspended pending clarification of role boundaries. She read it once, then forwarded it to Paul with a single line. As predicted. By noon, the story had broken in a controlled way. An article framed around international cooperation and safety standards. Maggie's name was mentioned only once, buried deep in the text. That would change. At the base, Vaughn convened a closed-door meeting with senior staff. His tone was calm, reassuring. We will handle this internally, he said. We will demonstrate that our program operates with integrity and discipline. Someone at the table shifted. Sir, an instructor, ventured the data she referenced. Vaughn raised a hand. Is under review. The instructor fell silent. Later alone in his office, Vaughn opened a locked drawer and removed an old file. Yellowed pages, handwritten notes, names he hadn't thought about in years. He flipped to one and stopped. Daniel Reynolds. He stared at it longer than necessary. Back in Prescott, Maggie went about her day as if nothing had changed. She taught her afternoon class. She answered questions. She laughed once briefly at a student's joke. But beneath it all, she felt the pressure building the way weather shifted before a storm. After class, the dean pulled her aside. Margaret, he said, gently, there have been inquiries. I imagined there would be, she replied. We support academic freedom, he continued, but the board is sensitive to controversy. She nodded. I understand. He studied her face. Are you going to be okay? She met his gaze. I always am. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Maggie sat on her back porch with a cup of tea she didn't drink. The desert cooled slowly, the air heavy with anticipation. Her phone lay face down on the table. She thought of Daniel, of the last time they'd spoken, of the way he'd trusted the system to catch what individuals missed. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She turned it over and answered. Ms. Reynolds, a man's voice said. Older. Polished. This is David Klein with the Federal Aviation Safety Review Board. We'd like to speak with you. When she asked, as soon as possible. She looked out at the darkening horizon. I'm available. After the call ended, she sat there a long time, listening to the wind move through the scrub. Far away in an office, lit by a single lamp, Colonel Vaughn drafted another memo. This one, sharper, more aggressive. He believed in preemption, in striking before being struck. He didn't know yet how many people were now watching. And Margaret Reynolds, sitting quietly in her small desert home, felt the weight of what she had begun settle fully onto her shoulders. She did not regret it, but she knew now. There would be no quiet ending. The conference room in Washington smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper, a place designed to feel neutral, and ended up feeling cold. Margaret Reynolds sat alone at one end of the long table, hands folded back, straight eyes steady. No lawyer beside her, no notes. Just a slim folder she had brought herself placed neatly within reach, but left unopened. Across from her, 3 people reviewed documents on tablets. David Klein sat in the center. Late 60s, gray hair combed back with care. The kind of man who had spent his life listening without revealing much. On either side of him were analysts, younger, quieter, their attention fixed on screens and timestamps. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Klein said. "You asked Maggie?" replied. A faint smile crossed his face. "We did." He leaned back slightly. "Before we begin, I want to be clear. This is not an interrogation, it's a clarification." "Those are rarely different," Maggie said. Klein accepted that without comment. "We've reviewed the joint exercise footage," he continued. "We've reviewed your remarks. We've also reviewed a number of incident reports flagged by your statements." One of the analysts slid a tablet toward Klein. He glanced at it, then looked back at Maggie. "You have a reputation," he said, "for restraint." Maggie nodded once. "It's cheaper than outrage." Klein exhaled softly. "Why speak now?" She considered him. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of ventilation. "Because the pattern repeated," she said. "And because people were still being trained to ignore it," Pattern Klein repeated. "Explain." Maggie reached for her folder and opened it. Inside were copies. Not originals, never originals, diagrams, timelines, margins filled with neat handwriting. "These are training deviations logged as anomalies," she said, sliding one page forward. "Each dismissed individually, each within acceptable margins. Until you overlay them." One of the analysts leaned in, eyes narrowing. "And what do you see?" Klein asked. "A culture that rewards confidence over caution," Maggie replied. "A leadership style that treats warning signs as challenges to authority." Klein's gaze sharpened. "You're referring to Colonel Vaughn." "I'm referring to decisions Maggie said. Names come later." There was a pause. Klein tapped a finger lightly against the table. "Colonel Vaughn has submitted his own documentation." "I assumed he would," Maggie said. "He claims your presence destabilized the program," Klein said, "that you undermined command cohesion." Maggie looked at him evenly. "Did anyone get hurt?" "No," Klein said. "Then cohesion held," she replied. "For now." Silence again. He studied her face, searching for something. Emotion, satisfaction, regret. He found none. Outside that room, the story continued to grow legs. By afternoon, defense correspondents were trading theories. Retired pilots weighed in on podcasts. Someone dug up an old safety review Maggie had authored decades ago and circulated it online, highlighting passages that read, "less like recommendations and more like prophecy." At the base, Vaughn paced his office as updates arrived in clipped bursts. Temporary suspension of Maggie's credentials. Request for interviews. Internal review scheduled. He told himself this was manageable. All storms passed. But then Major Porter knocked. "They've requested your presence in Washington," she said. When Vaughn asked, "Tomorrow," his jaw tightened. "On whose authority?" Federal Porter replied. Vaughn nodded slowly. "Prepare the briefing." When she left, he sat heavily in his chair. His eyes drifted to the locked drawer again. He did not open it this time. Back in Prescott, Maggie returned home after the meeting with a familiar weariness settling into her bones. The desert greeted her with its quiet indifference. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and set her keys down in the same place she always did. Her phone buzzed. "Captain Lawson." She answered, I heard you went east, he said. Yes. Is it bad? He asked. She considered the question. It's honest. He let out a breath. That might be worse. Sometimes Maggie agreed. There was a pause. People are talking, Lawson said. Some are scared. They should be, Maggie replied. Fear is a signal. You don't sound angry, he said. I'm not, she said. I'm focused. That night, Maggie pulled the old binder out again. She laid it open on the kitchen table, flipping through pages she knew by heart. Names, dates, small decisions that had led to irreversible outcomes. She stopped at one page and traced the edge with her finger. Daniel. She closed the binder. The next morning in Washington, Vaughn sat at the same table Maggie had occupied the day before. His posture was rigid, his answers polished. We followed protocol, he said. Any deviations were within acceptable risk. Klein listened. The analysts listened. No one interrupted. And Ms. Reynolds Vaughn continued acted outside her scope. Klein raised a hand gently. We will determine scope. Vaughn's eyes flickered. You were aware of the prior incidents, she referenced. Klein said. Vaughn hesitated. Just a fraction. I was aware of the reports. And you chose not to escalate, Klein said. I chose to trust my officers, Vaughn replied. Klein nodded. Trust is important. He tapped his tablet. So is documentation. The room grew quiet. That afternoon, Maggie received another call. This time from a woman named Karen Doyle, a reporter with a reputation for patience. I won't quote you without consent, Doyle said. But I'd like to understand. Maggie agreed to meet her, not to speak, to listen. They sat in a small cafe near the college. Doyle asked careful questions about systems, about leadership, about when silence became complicity. You don't seem interested in being vindicated, Doyle observed. I'm interested in being accurate, Maggie replied. That night, the first opinion piece ran. It did not name Maggie as a hero. It did not accuse Vaughn outright. It asked questions. It linked patterns. It invited scrutiny. By the end of the week, Vaughn's authority felt thinner. Meetings were postponed. Decisions deferred. The system hesitated, uncertain which way to lean. Maggie felt the cost in small ways. Her consulting contracts paused. The college asked her to take leave while matters were clarified. Friends checked in cautiously, unsure what to say. She sat alone on her porch one evening, watching the sky darken the stars, emerging one by one. The weight pressed down now, heavier than before. Paul Hensley called just after sunset. It's widening, he said. I know, Maggie replied. They're looking beyond Vaughn, he said, at culture, at oversight, at who looked away. She closed her eyes. That will make enemies. You already have them, Paul said gently. She smiled faintly. I always have. When the call ended, she remained there, listening to the desert breathe. She had opened a door that could not be closed. Not by her, not by Vaughn, not by anyone who understood what was at stake. And for the first time since that morning in the hangar, she allowed herself to feel it. The fear, not of what might happen to her, but of how many warnings it might take before people finally listened. The first resignation came quietly, buried in an internal bulletin most people skimmed past. An assistant safety officer at the base submitted his papers citing personal reasons. No statement, no interviews. But among those who knew how the system worked, the timing spoke louder than any confession. Margaret Reynolds heard about it from Paul Hensley over a clipped phone call while she was reorganizing the bookshelves in her living room, an act that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with keeping her hands busy. They're starting to move, Paul said. Carefully, like chess pieces that don't want to be noticed. Pieces don't move on their own, Maggie replied. Someone's pushing. Yes, Paul said, and that's what's making them nervous. At the base, Colonel Vaughn felt the shift even before the resignation crossed his desk. Meetings ended faster. Questions lingered longer. Officers who used to nod automatically now paused before agreeing. Not defiance, hesitation, the most dangerous kind. He adjusted his strategy. Instead of force, he chose isolation. Maggie's name was quietly removed from agendas. References to her reports were labeled preliminary. Emails mentioning her were redirected, delayed, buried under layers of procedural review. Vaughn framed it as professionalism, as containment. He believed if he starved the issue of oxygen, it would suffocate. Captain Lawson noticed the change immediately. He noticed because he had been part of the machinery that made it possible. He sat in a closed briefing, watching Vaughn dismiss a safety concern with a phrase Lawson had used himself years earlier. Acceptable variance, operational necessity. The words tasted different now. Bitter. After the meeting, Lawson found Major Porter in the hallway. "You're seeing it too," he said quietly. Porter glanced around before answering. "Seeing what?" "The pattern," Lawson said. "The way things disappear." Porter hesitated, then nodded once. "Be careful." Of what Lawson asked. "Of choosing sides before you know where the ground will settle," she replied. That night, Lawson sat at his kitchen table long after his family had gone to bed, staring at an old flight log. He thought of Maggie's voice over the channel. Calm, unyielding. He thought of the trainees watching absorbing lessons they hadn't known they were being taught. He picked up his phone. Maggie answered on the third ring. "You don't owe me anything," she said before he could speak. "I know," Lawson replied. "That's why I'm calling." They spoke for nearly an hour, about procedures, about fear disguised as discipline, about the cost of silence. Maggie didn't persuade him. She didn't need to. She only asked questions and waited. When the call ended, Lawson felt lighter and terrified. In Washington, the review widened again. David Klein sat with a stack of summaries spread across his desk, red tabs marking points of convergence. Different programs, different years, same decisions, same language. He rubbed his temples. "Get me the training board minutes," he said to an aide. "All of them." "Yes, sir." "And flag anything signed by Vaughn," he added, "even if it looks harmless." The aide paused. "That's a lot of material." Klein looked up. "So is a graveyard." The next article landed harder than the first. This one named names, not accusations, connections. Vaughn's career timeline, his role in multiple programs, the way incidents clustered around his authority like static. The headline didn't shout. It asked a question. How much risk is too much? Maggie read it at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside her. She recognized the careful phrasing. Karen Doyle's work, balanced, relentless. Her phone buzzed. Texts from people she hadn't heard from in years. Some supportive, some cautious. One simply said, "I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." She closed her eyes. At the base, Vaughn slammed the newspaper onto his desk. "This is a hit job," he said to no one. But when he looked at the article again, his anger faltered. Not because it was unfair, because it was accurate enough to be dangerous. He called in Porter. "Who's talking?" he demanded. Porter stood her ground. "Sir, this is public record." "Someone is feeding them context," Vaughn snapped. Porter met his gaze. Maybe the context was always there. Vaughn dismissed her with a wave. When she left, he locked the door and opened the drawer. The file waited. He flipped through it faster now. Notes he'd justified at the time. Decisions made under pressure. Rationalized, defended, forgotten. Daniel Reynolds' name stared back at him. For the first time, Vaughn felt something close to doubt. Maggie felt the pressure in smaller ways. The grocery clerk, who recognized her from television and asked for an autograph, she refused. the neighbor who avoided her eyes, the former colleague who crossed the street rather than engage. She welcomed the solitude. It gave her space to think. One afternoon, as she sorted through mail, she found a handwritten letter addressed to her. No return address. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Ms. Reynolds, I was in Hangar 7 that day. I didn't understand what I was seeing until later. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for showing us what calm looks like under pressure. She folded the letter and placed it in the binder. At the base, the trainees were restless. They whispered during breaks. They debated quietly. Some defended Vaughn. Others questioned him for the first time. Authority, once monolithic, had fractured into opinion. During a training flight, a young pilot aborted a maneuver early. When asked why, he said, "The margin didn't feel right." No one reprimanded him. The ripple spread. In Washington, Klein received confirmation that Vaughn's testimony had conflicts, small ones, inconsistencies that suggested memory shaped by convenience. He closed the file and leaned back. "We're not there yet," he said to himself, "but we're close." That evening, Maggie stood in her backyard, watching the stars emerge. The desert was quiet again, but it felt different now, charged, like the air before lightning. Paul called just after 9. "They're scheduling a formal hearing," he said. "Closed session. Vaughn will be there." Maggie's grip tightened on the phone. "And me." "Yes," Paul said. "As a witness." She exhaled slowly. "When soon?" After the call ended, she remained still, the weight of it settling fully at last. This was the point of no return, not because of Vaughn, because of what would come after. Truth changed things. It never stopped at one man. She went inside and opened the garment bag. The flight suit lay neatly folded, unchanged. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. She turned off the light and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Somewhere engines would soon roar again. Not in the sky, in rooms where decisions were made, where power shifted hands. Margaret Reynolds closed her eyes. Whatever happened next, she would meet it the same way she always had, calm, precise, unflinching. The hearing room had no windows, only polished wood and recessed lights that never flickered. Margaret Reynolds took her seat at the long table without being directed. She placed her hands, flat palms down, grounding herself in the texture of the wood. The air carried the faint scent of coffee and recycled air, the smell of places where decisions were made far from consequences. Colonel Thomas Vaughn sat across from her. He looked smaller here, not diminished, but contained. His uniform was immaculate ribbons, aligned with mechanical precision. His posture was rigid chin, lifted eyes forward. He did not look at her. Between them sat David Klein and 2 members of the review panel. No flags, no press, just recorders quietly blinking red. "This session is classified," Klein said. "We are here to establish facts, not narratives." Vaughn inclined his head. Understood. Maggie said nothing. Klein turned to her. "Ms. Reynolds, you are here as an expert witness. You are not under investigation." She nodded once. Colonel Von Klein continued. "You've submitted statements regarding operational decisions under your authority. We will address specific instances." The first document appeared on the screen behind them. A training sortie from years earlier. Dates, coordinates, weather conditions. Vaughn spoke smoothly. The decision was made with incomplete data. In hindsight is not our focus. Klein interrupted. Process is. Maggie watched Vaughn's hands. They were steady. Too steady. Another document appeared. Then another. Patterns emerged. Slight deviations. Waivers granted. Margins tightened just enough to save time. To impress superiors. To keep schedules intact. Colonel Klein said, "How many times did you override safety recommendations?" Vaughn's jaw flexed. "I don't recall an exact number." "Would you say more than once?" "Yes. More than 10 times." Vaughn hesitated. "Possibly." Maggie felt it then. The shift. Not in Vaughn. In the room. The analysts leaned forward. Pens paused. Klein turned to her. "Ms. Reynolds, at what point does variance become negligence?" She didn't rush her answer. When warnings are documented and ignored. When outcomes are reframed instead of addressed. When authority replaces analysis. Vaughn finally looked at her. "You're interpreting events through personal loss," he said, voice controlled but sharp. The room went still. Maggie met his gaze. "I'm interpreting them through math." A murmur rippled, quickly silenced. Klein raised a hand. "Colonel Vaughn, do not speculate on motive." Vaughn swallowed. "Apologies." The screen changed again. Daniel Reynolds. The room tightened. Even the air seemed to compress. This incident, Klein said carefully, was ruled non-preventable at the time. New review suggests otherwise. Vaughn's composure cracked just a hairline fracture. That mission was approved at levels above mine. "Approved," Klein said. "Based on whose data?" Silence. Maggie did not look at the screen. She knew every line by heart. Klein turned to her again. "Ms. Reynolds, did you review this operation?" "Yes," she said. And the margins were wrong," she said. "Not accidentally," repeatedly. Vaughn's voice rose. "You're implying intent." "No," Maggie replied evenly. "I'm describing outcome." The hearing paused for a brief recess. In the hallway, Vaughn stood alone, hands braced on the wall, breathing hard through his nose. Porter approached cautiously. "They're closing in," she said. "They're rewriting history," Vaughn snapped. "They're reading it," Porter corrected. "For the first time." Vaughn straightened. "I protected this program." Porter's eyes softened just a little. "You protected your version of it." Back inside, the session resumed. Klein folded his hands. "Colonel Vaughn, pending further review, you are placed on administrative leave." The words landed without drama. No gavel. No raised voice. Vaughn stared at Klein. "You're making a mistake," perhaps Klein said. "But it will be a documented one." Vaughn stood abruptly, chair scraping. For a moment it seemed he might say something else. Something raw. He didn't. He left the room without another glance at Maggie. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. Afterward, Maggie walked alone through the long corridor toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not relief. Something closer to gravity. Klein caught up to her near the elevators. "You were precise," he said. "That's what you asked for." "Yes," he replied. And it mattered. The elevator doors opened. Maggie stepped inside. Ms. Reynolds Klein added, "This isn't over." "I know," she said. "It never is." Back in Prescott, the night settled gently over the desert. Maggie sat on her porch, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. The stars emerged one by one, steady and indifferent. Her phone buzzed. "Captain Lawson, it's official," he said. "Vaughn's out. Interim command is in." "And the program?" Maggie asked. Paused. Lawson replied. "Reevaluated. People are asking questions." She closed her eyes. "Good." There was a pause. "You okay?" She considered the question. "I'm honest." Lawson exhaled. "That's a start." After the call, Maggie remained where she was listening to the desert breathe. The weight on her chest eased just slightly, replaced by a different ache. One that came from endings that didn't feel like victories. Inside, the binder sat on the table, closed. The garment bag leaned by the wall. She did not open either. The reckoning had begun. Not with fire or spectacle, but with records and rooms like the one she had just left. Slow. relentless. Margaret Reynolds watched a shooting star cut briefly across the sky. For the first time in a long while, she let herself believe that some trajectories once altered could not be forced back into old paths. And somewhere beyond the desert systems that had relied on silence began finally to feel the strain of speaking aloud. The morning the documents went public, the desert felt louder. Margaret Reynolds noticed it before she heard the news. Trucks on the highway sounded closer. Wind rattled the porch railing with more insistence. Even the sky seemed taut, stretched thin above Prescott, as if waiting for something to break. She was halfway through her run when her phone began vibrating in the pocket of her jacket. She ignored it at first. 1 mile, 2. Her breathing found its rhythm. Muscles warmed. She rounded the bend near the dry wash and slowed to a stop, hands on her knees, chest, rising and falling. She pulled the phone out. 6 missed calls. Paul, Lawson. An unfamiliar number with a Washington area code. A text from Karen Doyle, short and unadorned. It's out. Maggie stood there for a moment, staring at the words. Then she straightened and walked the rest of the way home. Inside, she showered, dressed, and made coffee. The routine steadied her. The radio was already talking when she turned it on. Careful language. Phrases like newly released materials and expanded review. No conclusions yet. Just the sound of something heavy shifting its weight. She sat at the kitchen table and listened. Across the country, servers strained under the traffic. Redacted reports circulated. Timelines assembled by people who had never met each other, but recognized the same shape when they saw it. Decisions layered on decisions, each one defensible alone, damning together. Colonel Thomas Vaughn's name appeared in print without titles for the first time in decades. At the base, confusion spread faster than orders. Interim Command issued statements about cooperation and transparency. Training flights were grounded. Instructors gathered in small knots, voices low, eyes darting. The culture that had thrived on certainty now floated without an anchor. Captain Lawson stood in the hangar, staring at the floor, where Maggie's folded flight suit had rested weeks earlier. It was gone now, the chair empty, the absence louder than anything she had said. He felt exposed, not accused, seen. He turned when Major Porter approached, tablet in hand. "They're reopening old cases," she said quietly. Lawson nodded. "They should." Porter hesitated. "Some people won't survive the scrutiny." Lawson met her eyes. Some didn't survive the decisions. Porter looked away. In Washington, David Klein read through the overnight summaries with mounting gravity. The scope was widening beyond anything he had initially anticipated. Patterns extended past Vaughn. Not crimes, habits, incentives, blind spots rewarded until they calcified into policy. He paused at a margin note written years earlier by a consultant whose name now carried weight again. Spectre. He leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. Maggie's phone rang while she was grading papers. She let it ring twice before answering. "Yes," she said. "Ms. Reynolds," the unfamiliar voice said, measured professional. "This is Assistant Secretary Nolan. I'd like to speak with you." When Maggie asked, "Today if possible." She glanced at the clock. "I have class." A pause. "Tomorrow then." "That works." When the call ended, she set the phone down and returned to the stack of exams. She circled a wrong answer and wrote a brief note in the margin. "Check your assumption. Try again." Her students filed in that afternoon quieter than usual. A few glanced at her with something like curiosity. One of them, a former Army medic in his 70s, lingered after class. "They're talking about you on the news," he said. Maggie met his gaze. "Are they?" He nodded. "You always said systems fail when people stop asking questions." "I did," she said. He smiled faintly. "Looks like they're asking now." That evening, the first editorial ran without hedging. It didn't lionize Maggie. It didn't vilify Vaughn. It framed the story as a mirror held up to institutions that prized speed over care and obedience over judgment. The comments were divided. Some praised courage, others accused betrayal. Maggie did not read them. She sat on her porch as the sun sank, watching the light drain from the hills. Her phone lay beside her silent for once. She felt hollowed out, not empty, cleared. Paul called just after dark. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm here," she said. "They're offering you protection." Paul continued. "Legal, media, the works." "No," Maggie replied. He sighed. "I had to ask. I know. They're also offering positions," he added. "Advisory roles, high level." She closed her eyes. "I didn't do this to trade one room for another." Paul was quiet for a moment. "Vaughn's lawyer is pushing back." "Of course he is." Still, Paul said, "This will get ugly." "It already is," Maggie said. "It just took time to notice." When the call ended, she went inside and opened the binder one last time. She removed the page with Daniel's name on it and held it for a long moment. Then she slid it back into place and closed the binder for good. Across town, a television glowed in Captain Lawson's living room. His teenage daughter watched the screen, frowning. "Dad," she said, "is that your base?" He nodded. "It is." "Were you there?" she asked. "Yes." She studied him. "Did you know?" He swallowed. "I didn't know enough." She considered that, then nodded slowly. "I guess that's how it happens." Lawson turned the television off. Late that night, Maggie stood in her backyard under a sky crowded with stars. The desert was still again, but it felt changed, like a field after fire quiet, but not the same. Her phone buzzed once more. Unknown number. She answered. "Miss..." Reynolds, a woman's voice said. "Calm, firm. This is Eleanor Finch from the Office of Joint Oversight. We're convening a public session next week." Maggie waited. "We'd like you present," Finch continued. "Not to testify, to observe." A corner of Maggie's mouth lifted just slightly. "That's a change." "Yes," Finch said. "It is." After the call, Maggie remained where she was listening to the night. She thought of the hangar, the folded suit, the jet slicing the sky without spectacle, only purpose. The truth had not arrived in a roar. It had arrived the way it always did, incrementally, reluctantly, dragged into the light by those willing to stand where shadows gathered. Margaret Reynolds went inside and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would be louder. But for now, the desert rested, and so did she. The public session was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but the line outside the building began forming before sunrise. Margaret Reynolds arrived early, as she always did, and waited across the street where the marble steps of the federal complex caught the first light of day. Reporters clustered near the entrance microphones, already raised, rehearsing questions they hoped would land on the evening news. Camera operators adjusted tripods, checking angles, testing focus. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that fed on uncertainty. She stayed where she was, no escort, no announcement. Just a woman in a dark jacket, hands in her pockets, watching a system prepare to explain itself. When she crossed the street, a few heads turned. Someone recognized her. A whisper traveled faster than sound. Spectre. That old name had resurfaced again, passed between mouths like contraband. She ignored it and entered the building. Inside, security waved her through with quiet efficiency. Her badge was temporary, observer status. The irony was not lost on her. The hearing room was larger than the one before. Higher ceiling, tiered seating, flags positioned just out of frame for the cameras. This time, the recorders were not hidden. This time, the lights were bright. David Klein sat at the center of the panel, flanked by officials from Joint Oversight, Federal Aviation Safety, and an Ethics Review Board that rarely convened unless something had gone deeply wrong. Their faces were composed, but the strain showed in small ways. Tighter mouths, slower blinks. Colonel Vaughn was not present. That absence spoke louder than any testimony. The session opened with prepared statements, language scrubbed clean, acknowledgement of concerns, commitment to transparency. Applause from no one. Maggie sat in the second row, hands folded in her lap, gaze steady. She did not look at the cameras. She looked at the panel, at the documents projected behind them, at the timelines that now spanned decades instead of months. When the questions began, they did not target individuals. They targeted processes. Why were safety waivers clustered around specific leadership tenures? Why incident reviews stopped at certain thresholds? Why dissenting evaluations were marked advisory and never escalated? Each answer revealed another seam. Klein leaned forward. This panel has reviewed evidence suggesting systemic pressure to prioritize output over margin. We are here to understand how that pressure was applied and by whom. A former operations director took the stand. He spoke carefully, voice-measured eyes flicking once toward the cameras. "No one ever told us to be unsafe," he said. But the message was clear. Don't slow things down. From where Klein asked. The man hesitated. From above. Who above? Another pause. Longer this time. Command. The word landed heavy. Maggie felt it ripple through the room. Not shock. Recognition. Outside news alerts flashed across screens. Analysts debated whether this constituted failure or correction. Commentators split along familiar lines. Some framed it as accountability long overdue. Others called it institutional betrayal. At the base, Captain Lawson watched the live feed in a briefing room with a handful of trainees. He saw his younger self in their faces. The hunger to belong, the fear of stepping out of line. One of them spoke up. "Sir," she asked if the system was wrong. "Why didn't anyone stop it sooner?" Lawson swallowed. "Because systems don't announce when they're failing," he said. "People have to." Back in the hearing room, a document appeared on the screen. A redacted memo, dated years earlier, authored by a consultant whose name had been scrubbed from the final version. Spectre. The camera caught Maggie in profile as the memo's language was read aloud. Calm, technical, unemotional, a warning disguised as analysis. This memo recommended immediate changes, Klein said. Those changes were not implemented. Why? No one answered. The silence stretched until it became accusatory. Klein turned to the room. "This panel will recess briefly." During the break, reporters surged. Maggie remained seated. She felt the weight of eyes on her, the temptation to turn her into a symbol. She did not move. An official approached her quietly. "Ms. Reynolds, the panel may request a statement from you." She nodded. "If they do." When the session resumed, Klein spoke without notes. This review has identified failures that cannot be attributed to a single individual, he said. But neither can they be separated from leadership choices. Accountability does not end with removal. It requires acknowledgement. He looked directly at Maggie. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, "you were invited here as an observer. But your work underpins much of what we are discussing. Do you wish to speak?" The room held its breath. Maggie stood. She did not approach the microphone. She did not raise her voice. "I didn't come to speak," she said. "I came to listen, because listening is where correction starts." A murmur moved through the audience. She continued. "I was trained to believe that systems exist to protect people from individual error." That's true. But systems are built by people. maintained by people, and sometimes broken by people who believe they are exempt from consequence. She paused, letting the words settle. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about memory. If you forget how you failed, you will repeat it. If you punish without understanding, you will hide the next failure better." No applause followed. None was needed. She sat back down. The panel recessed again, this time longer. Decisions were made behind closed doors, language refined, paths chosen. By late afternoon, the findings were announced. Mandatory restructuring, independent safety oversight, review of all programs flagged under the identified patterns, temporary suspension of certain training pipelines until compliance could be verified. No names were shouted, no arrests made, but careers shifted, power redistributed. When Maggie left the building, the crowd parted instinctively. A reporter called out, asking how it felt to be vindicated. She stopped and turned. "I wasn't vindicated," she said. "I was heard. There's a difference." Then she walked away. That evening, she returned to Prescott as the sun bled into the horizon. The desert welcomed her back with its familiar quiet. She sat on her porch, the weight of the day settling into her muscles. Her phone buzzed. Paul Hensley. "It's done," he said. She closed her eyes. "It started." He laughed softly. "You always did think long-term." After the call, Maggie went inside and opened the garment bag. She unfolded the flight suit, slowly smoothing the fabric. She held it up, then folded it again. She did not put it on. Instead, she placed it back in the bag and closed the zipper. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, indifferent to human reckoning. Maggie watched them, thinking of margins and choices of how close things came before correction finally took hold. Tomorrow, there would be more noise, more debate, more resistance. But tonight, for the first time since the hangar, she allowed herself to rest. Not because the fight was over, but because the truth had finally found its altitude. The desert did not celebrate victories. Margaret Reynolds understood that, as she stepped into the cool morning air a week after the public session, the sky pale and wide above Prescott, the world already moving on. News cycles had shifted. Commentators found newer conflicts, louder scandals. The name Vaughn appeared less often, now replaced by phrases like structural reform and oversight realignment. Important words, necessary words, but distant. She ran her usual route shoes, striking gravel in a steady rhythm. Her breath came evenly. The ache in her knees reminded her of time of limits she respected instead of resented. At the halfway point, she slowed to a walk and looked out over the desert wash, dry and patient. Change here never announced itself. It arrived grain by grain. When she returned home, there was an envelope waiting on the kitchen table. No return address. Thick paper. Official, but restrained. Inside was a single-page letter from Joint Oversight, thanking her for service rendered, noting that her observer role was concluded. Attached was a separate note, handwritten. "If you are ever willing to advise quietly without titles or press, there are people who would listen now." She folded the paper and set it aside. Not a rejection, not an acceptance. Just a pause. Later that morning, Captain Lawson's car pulled into her driveway. He stepped out slowly, as if unsure he still belonged there. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him. Not weaker, just more awake. "I was in town," he said when she opened the door. "I know," she replied. They sat on the porch, 2 cups of coffee cooling between them. Lawson stared out at the yard for a long moment before speaking. "They offered me a position," he said. "Safety compliance. Not glamorous. No fast track." And Maggie said, "And I said yes," he replied. Because I don't want to explain silence to my daughter ever again. She nodded. That's a good reason. He hesitated. I wanted to thank you. She shook her head. You did the work. He smiled faintly. You showed me where to look. When he left, the house felt quiet again, but not empty. Maggie spent the afternoon sorting through old files, not for review, but for closure. She shredded what no longer served a purpose. She boxed up materials she would keep. The binder stayed closed, placed on the highest shelf. That evening, Karen Doyle's article ran one last time, not as breaking news, as a reflection. It traced the aftermath, the reforms, the discomfort, the cost. It ended not with Maggie's name, but with a sentence about how institutions rarely collapse from attack. They erode from habits left unchallenged. Maggie read it once and turned the page. Days passed. The college reinstated her quietly. Students returned to her classroom with the same mix of confusion and hope they always carried. She taught equations and systems, but now, when she spoke about margins, eyes stayed on her longer. One afternoon, the older medic approached again after class. I watched the whole thing, he said. Didn't think anyone like you still existed. She smiled. We usually don't advertise. At home, she finally opened the garment bag. She removed the flight suit and laid it out on the bed. The fabric still held its shape, familiar, honest. She ran her hands along the seams, then folded it carefully, not with ceremony, but with respect. She placed it in a cedar chest beneath old photographs and closed the lid. Some chapters didn't need to be displayed to be honored. On a clear morning later that month, she drove out beyond town to a quiet overlook where the desert stretched uninterrupted. Training jets crossed the sky far above their formation, tight, disciplined. She watched until they vanished, leaving nothing but sound, fading into distance. Her phone buzzed once. Paul Hensley. They implemented the last recommendation he said, independent review boards. Rotational command limits. Good, she replied. They wanted to name something after you, he added. I said you wouldn't like that. She smiled. You were right. As the sun dipped low, Maggie sat on the hood of her car and watched the light soften. She thought of Daniel, of the line between caution and courage, of how close everything had come before someone chose to speak clearly instead of loudly. She did not feel triumphant. She felt settled. The desert cooled. The sky deepened. Somewhere, engines roared, then quieted, part of a cycle older than any institution. Maggie turned toward home, toward lesson plans and early mornings, and the quiet work of helping others see what they were capable of before they believed it themselves. Stories like hers rarely ended with applause. They ended with continuity, with systems adjusted just enough to matter, with people a little less willing to look away. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments with 3 simple words: truth still matters.